My daughter, now a millionaire, threw me out of her house when I approached her for a loan to save my struggling business. Her response was nothing short of cruel. "You always embarrass me. Can't you just forget about me and improve your own life?" I was stunned to hear those words so distant from the loving child I once raised. A few days later, I happened upon her social media where she proudly posted a video of a gorgeous beachfront mansion she had bought for her mother and stepfather. The caption said it all: "Best I ever got. Grateful for my mom and stepdad." Heart emojis poured into the comments and admiration followed suit. I couldn't hold back my emotions and left a simple comment: "Nice house. Enjoy." But let's step back for a moment, to a time when things were different, when it was just the two of us living in that tiny, leaky apartment above the pharmacy on Market Street. Her mother had walked out when she was 6. No note, no explanation, just an empty closet and a voicemail explaining she needed to find herself. That left me with no room for self-reflection or grief. My focus became raising her and surviving each day. I worked back-breaking shifts and still made time to tuck her in with bedtime stories every night, not because I was some kind of saint, but because there was nothing in the world I loved more than her. I did everything: cooked, cleaned, and soothed her scraped knees. Every night I reminded her, "You are not alone. I'm still here." And I truly believed those words would always mean something to her. We didn't have much, but I strived to give her the best life I could. When I couldn't afford new clothes every year or ballet classes, I still ensured she never went hungry or missed out on school trips. Her curiosity and eventual passion for technology were things I nurtured despite our hardships. At 13, I scrimped and saved enough to buy her a second-hand laptop when she expressed an interest in coding. The smile on her face when she built her first website is etched in my mind. "One day I'll have my own tech company," she said excitedly, bouncing on our worn-out couch. And oh, how I believed her. Every step of her journey filled me with pride. From school awards to graduations where I would sit front row after begging my employers for time off. When she got into Stanford with a scholarship, I broke down in the men's bathroom at work, not out of sadness, but out of sheer relief that we had finally made it through the hardest parts. But then things changed when success came knocking. She launched her company the same year I lost my second business to the recession. I didn't tell her right away because I didn't want to burden her. She seemed so busy with press tours, meeting celebrities, and hosting panels. I watched from afar with pride. My daughter, the little girl who had once gripped my shirt during thunderstorms, now conquering the world. It wasn't long before everything became transactional. Birthday calls were replaced with gift cards. One Christmas, she mailed me a sweater with the tag still attached. No card, just a receipt outlining the return policy. Still, to anyone who'd listen, I boasted about her accomplishments. My daughter's a genius. She built an empire from nothing. When my latest business, a small delivery startup, began falling apart, I had no choice but to ask for help. Not charity, just a loan to hold me over until I could recover. Rehearsing what I'd say over and over again, I went to see her at her mansion, a place that seemed worlds away from where we'd come from. The house was massive, 3 stories made of glass and stone. Even getting through the security gate took time while her assistant verified I was on the list. When she finally appeared, there was no warmth in her reception, no hug, no "how are you?" Just a sharp glance at her phone as she warned, "I only have 15 minutes." I explained my plight as simply as possible: $50,000 as a bridge loan to save what I'd spent years building. She barely gave my proposal a glance before snapping, "Why are you always asking for help?" That accusation hit me like a blow. In truth, I'd never asked anything of her in adulthood. "You always embarrass me," she continued, looking at me like I was a beggar on her pristine doorstep. "Can't you just forget about me and improve your own life?" Her words cut deeper than anything I could have expected. I left silently, unable to fathom how the child I nurtured through sleepless nights and sacrificed everything for could speak to me so coldly. 3 days later came that Instagram post, the one filled with commented positively about my work, during a networking event. I didn't pay it much mind. It felt insignificant at the time. But then, more whispers started coming my way, and before long it seemed like everyone knew my name. People started reaching out with collaborations, deals, and opportunities I hadn't dared dream of in years. Slowly, the business began to transform from a struggling endeavor to something stable, even promising. I threw myself into it fully, not just to keep moving forward, but to redefine who I was without her shadow looming over me. Day by day, step by step, I dismantled the narrative I had lived for so long, the one that revolved entirely around being her father. It wasn't easy. Every success still came with a pang of guilt or a flash of sadness because I wasn't sharing it with her. But those moments grew fewer and farther between as I learned what it meant to stand alone, to be my own anchor. I learned to live again. Alone, but alive. That doesn't mean I don't miss her. That doesn't mean I don't wake in the middle of the night sometimes, tears slipping down my face before I even fully remember why my heart feels so heavy. But those moments pass faster now. I let them come because resisting them makes them linger. Then I breathe and I let them go. She has her life now. Her house on the cliff. Her meticulously curated story. Her glossy photos and perfect captions. I accept that I don't belong there anymore. She made her choice, and I've made mine. To keep waking up every day and choosing myself after decades of putting someone else first. And maybe that's what it takes to move forward. Not waiting for love to be rekindled where it only smolders. Not staying trapped in grief over a bond that's been broken. But learning, painfully, patiently, to embrace the person looking back at you in the mirror. The parent who isn't just a parent anymore. The human being who still has so much left to give and receive, even if it comes from unexpected places. One day, she might look back and regret, or she might not. Either way, I'll keep going. Because for once in my life, I'm trying to love someone who won't walk away from me. Myself. But this wasn't about her anymore. This was about the future, one built on solid ground instead of shaky promises. We updated the systems, streamlined operations, and stabilized finances. We cut back on unnecessary ventures and focused on what made the company unique in the first place. It wasn't easy, and there were missteps along the way, but progress was being made. One night, long after most of the office had emptied out, I found myself staring at an old framed photo tucked away in a storage room. It was from her first big pitch meeting all those years ago, her standing at the head of a conference table, beaming with confidence, me sitting off to the side, all but invisible in the corner of the frame. How ironic that now, all these years later, it had come full circle. I didn't hold on to resentment anymore. Time had chipped away at that. What had once been anger had softened into something quieter, something closer to understanding. She had made her choices, and so had I. Her path took her in one direction, mine in another. Whatever came next would be shaped by those choices. In the months that followed, we started turning things around. The numbers improved, clients came back, and the team rediscovered their footing. It wasn't flashy or glamorous. It was just steady progress built on mutual respect and shared purpose. As for her, I had no idea if she was watching from afar or if she'd completely moved on. A part of me hoped she'd see what I'd done for the company, not as an act of defiance, but as an attempt to preserve what she'd created. To honor its potential even when she couldn't or wouldn't. Life rarely gives you the neat endings you imagine when you're younger. Sometimes there's no grand gesture or dramatic reunion. Sometimes redemption looks like quiet consistency. Sometimes healing comes not from looking back, but from moving forward, and so I kept going. More determined than ever to make this company into something worth believing in, not just for me or for her, but for everyone counting on its survival. Because at the end of the day, it wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about doing right by the people who needed someone to believe in them again. My desk drawer, a quiet reminder of why I had fought so hard to get here. This wasn't about power, revenge, or proving anything to anyone. It was about creating something better, something lasting. And it was about doing it the right way. The months rolled on, and I saw the transformation unfold. The company no longer wore the scars of its past missteps. Instead, it grew stronger, more resilient, more human. The culture shifted dramatically. People talked more freely, ideas flowed without fear of reprimand, and the air of desperation that once lingered in every meeting room finally dissipated. I still walked past her framed awards every day. At first, I considered taking them down for good, but I decided against it. They weren't just relics of her success. They were lessons etched into the glass, symbols of what happens when ambition overrides authenticity. So I left them there, silent witnesses to a story that no longer defined me or the people working here. They had moved beyond her, beyond those days when Chaos reigned unchecked. It hadn't been easy, but the payoff was in the smiles returning to the faces of my staff and the renewed sense of purpose in their work. We were threading together a new identity, and in some ways it had very little to do with me. Watching others flourish under ethical leadership gave me an unshakable pride, not in my accomplishments alone, but in what we were all building together. And that was more than enough. 2 years later, our numbers looked better than they ever had, but more importantly, there was trust again. Trust in leadership, trust in each other, and trust in the future we were shaping. Headlines continued to focus on the turnaround story, often romanticizing the rise from ashes narrative, but I left that noise to the public. I didn't care for spotlight endorsements anymore. The real wins were quieter, the kind you feel deep in your chest when things settle into their rightful place. As for her, I haven't heard anything since that day she stood in my office pleading for help I couldn't give. Maybe she found her way back, or maybe she's still lost in the maze of her choices. Either way, her absence no longer haunted me. I had already let go long before she walked through that door. Because some chapters aren't meant to be rewritten for someone else's convenience. They're meant to end so better ones can begin, and that's exactly where I was. Standing at the forefront of a new chapter, free to write it with integrity, humility, and care for the people who chose to believe in me when it mattered most. For them and for myself, I vowed to never let ego or desperation take the wheel. In their place, I embraced something much more powerful: purpose. She reached out again, this time through an email titled, "Please read." I almost didn't open it. My instinct to protect my boundaries was strong, but curiosity, as it so often does, nudged me to cut through my resistance. Her message was long and scattered in thought. She shared that she had begun therapy and was grappling with how everything fell apart. This time there was no plea for a job, just a search for forgiveness. "I've been living in a story where I was the victim," she wrote, "but I see now that in yours I was the villain." I read her words twice, then marked the email unread and let it sit there unanswered. Not out of malice, but because no response was owed. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words. In my own way, I had already forgiven her, not by engaging, but by moving forward, by refusing to let the void she left continue defining me. Forgiveness doesn't always require dialogue. It's often just a door that you close and never reopen. Around that time, she faded quietly from public relevance. She stopped appearing on conference panels, her think piece articles dried up, and her face disappeared from glossy social media ads. Even the family she once showcased as part of her narrative, her mother and stepfather, distanced themselves. Through a stray comment at a fundraiser, I learned they'd relocated to Florida and ceased answering her calls. Someone mentioned how ironic it was. At the exact moment she needed the very people around whom she'd built her image, they were nowhere to be found. I only nodded because there wasn't much more to say. Her empire had been crafted on shifting sands. When the inevitable tide came in, no one remained to help her rebuild. That wasn't karma. It was consequence. One afternoon, I paused outside the break room at work and caught the sound of laughter spilling out. A simple sound, yet strikingly profound in its normalcy. These were the same people who had spent years treading lightly, walking on eggshells to avoid finding themselves in her crosshairs. Now they thrived, free from that oppressive fear. It hit me then. This wasn't just a workplace anymore. It had become a second chance, for me and for everyone left burned by her relentless ambition. I allowed myself a moment of pride. It wasn't wrapped in bitterness or pettiness, just quiet pride. Something broken had been transformed into something functional, something hopeful, and it happened on my own terms. Occasionally, she would cross my thoughts. I'd wonder where she was or what shape her life had taken. But the difference now was that I no longer carried an urge to save her. That chapter of my life had healed. Whether she figured out her path was no longer tied to me. She wasn't my responsibility anymore. The safety net I once provided had been cut loose long ago. By the close of that fiscal year, things had improved dramatically. We didn't skyrocket to stardom, but we began turning a steady profit, a modest achievement, but one I was proud of nonetheless. I had no desire for meteoric growth or media attention. Sustainability and genuine stability mattered more to me now. Watching what glory chasing had done to her served as a cautionary tale. That level of unchecked hunger consumes people from the inside. My new team brought a different energy to the table, deliberate and intentional rather than impulsive and frantic. Slowly but surely, people noticed our progress. Employees felt taken care of, customers appreciated our reliability, and even investors began trickling back in. They weren't the flashy venture capitalists chasing trends and prestige this time around, but steadfast backers who valued trust and tangible outcomes. Ego had no power in the framework we were building. It was decency that drove results. Over time, fragments of news about her occasionally surfaced. She'd moved back into the city, settling for a small condo far removed from the luxury she once flaunted. Someone told me her car had been sold after loan payments were defaulted on. In whispered accounts filtered down through industry circles, I learned how gradually she'd fallen out of favor, poor choices stacking one atop another until her reputation couldn't bear their weight anymore. Broken commitments, ghosted meetings, sky-high staff turnover. Her name became a symbol not of success, but of instability and disregard. What struck me most wasn't her downfall itself, but how long she managed to navigate purely on bravado before everything fell apart. And when it finally did, those she had elevated on pedestals, the distant mother she glorified or the stepfather she flaunted in curated snapshots, were conspicuously absent grand gestures to forgive her. But forgiveness didn't have to mean reconciliation. It could simply mean letting go, not for her sake, but for mine. And that's what I chose to do. In the years that followed, I found peace in ways I never expected. My world became quieter, gentler, filled with people who truly saw and valued me, not for what I could give or sacrifice, but simply for who I was. That old version of me, the one who gave himself away piece by piece, no longer dictated my choices. I wasn't the man trying to hold everything together anymore. I was the man who learned how to build something new with what was left. Evelyn helped me see that love didn't have to be a transaction, a constant giving until I had nothing left. She taught me that love could just exist, steady, kind, without competition or conditions. She made me laugh in a way I hadn't in years. She reminded me that it was okay to expect reciprocity and respect, that those weren't selfish desires but essential foundations for anything real. Of course, there were moments when echoes of the past tried to creep back in, those quiet nights on the porch when memories brushed against my thoughts. But I didn't linger there for long. The what-ifs no longer held power over me. I wasn't tethered to the mistakes or missed opportunities of someone else's journey. I could acknowledge the pain, even honor it as part of what shaped me, but I didn't need to own it anymore. As time went on, the story of her rise and fall became less relevant to me. People would sometimes mention her in passing, hinting at her latest endeavors or setbacks, but I rarely engaged. It wasn't indifference. It was release. I didn't wish her ill, but I also didn't feel responsible for her redemption. That wasn't my job anymore. For once in my life, I had boundaries, not walls meant to shut people out entirely, but lines drawn with care to protect what I had fought so hard to rebuild. My dignity, my joy, my sense of self outside of someone else's shadow. The man I became. He wasn't perfect, but he was whole. And while some might see my story as one of heartbreak or estrangement, I saw it as one of evolution. Choosing myself wasn't an act of abandonment. It was an act of survival. It was acknowledging that some relationships can only take so much strain before they break, and that's not always something you can fix, no matter how much you want to. If she ever truly looked back and saw things clearly, maybe she'd understand why I didn't step in, why I didn't answer the calls or save the voicemails. Maybe she wouldn't, but it didn't matter anymore. Closure didn't have to come from her acknowledgement, it could come from my own acceptance. By then, my life wasn't defined by loss or regret, but by growth and possibility. The man who once thought love meant martyrdom had learned a different kind of love, the kind where you don't have to disappear for someone else to shine. And that realization? That was enough to carry me forward. So when the whispers of her struggles came my way, and they occasionally did, I met them with quiet resolve. Not bitterness, not resentment, just an understanding that her path was her own to walk now. Mine was no longer tangled with hers. Life moved on as it tends to do. And each day that passed without looking over my shoulder felt like a small victory, proof that letting go doesn't mean forgetting who you are. It means remembering yourself enough to keep going, even when walking away is the hardest thing you'll ever do. Public contrition isn't something I sought. What I needed was truth, consistency, and humanity. When she failed to offer that during My most vulnerable moments, I finally came to terms with the type of daughter I had raised. Brilliant, absolutely bold, undeniably. But beneath all that drive and ambition, there was a hollowness, an endless pursuit of success to validate her worth to people who were never going to stay long enough to matter. And in chasing that, she trampled over the one person who had stood by her from the very beginning. I think about her every now and then. Not with longing, but with contemplation. I wonder if she wakes up in her small condo with the same fire she once had, or if the silence around her is beginning to reveal the true cost of things. Does it teach her what her relentless chase has taken, not just from others, but from herself? Does she sit with her memories the way I sit with mine, knees sore, coffee in hand, watching the sun rise and reminding me that I'm still here? Because I am. I survived. I survived the heartbreak and the suffocating loneliness. I rebuilt, not out of spite, but out of necessity. The person I am now isn't consumed by bitterness. Instead, I'm resolute. I've learned that having boundaries doesn't make you unkind or unloving. It makes you honest with yourself and others. I gave her everything I had, but love loses its meaning when it isn't reciprocated. It turns into servitude. And I've chosen not to live a life of servitude any longer. Friends, colleagues, and even estranged family members who found their way back occasionally ask if I've considered letting her back into my life. My answer hasn't changed. She created the distance. I'm simply honoring it. That's not resentment, it's acceptance. You can't force a connection with someone who's already turned their back on it. You can't rebuild a bridge when they've scorched the beams and moved on. All you can truly do is live in peace and allow the silence between you to speak for itself, and I don't need to rewrite history to find peace either. I remember it all. The scraped knees, diaper changes, science fairs, midnight hospital runs. I remember being there every step of the way. Deep in my heart, I know I was a good father. The world doesn't have to acknowledge it for me to hold on to that knowledge because I carry it every single day in how I live, how I lead, and how I refuse to diminish myself for anyone again. Ironically, the part that hurt the most wasn't her rejection, but her revision of our history. The way she erased me as if I had been nothing more than a placeholder in her life. It wasn't just about being overlooked. It was about being intentionally excluded. Watching her paint this idealized picture of family while I sat alone eating leftovers, questioning where I went wrong, was a pain deeper than words can describe. But here's what I've come to understand. I didn't do anything wrong. I gave my all, and when she no longer needed me, she tossed me aside like an outdated tool. Yet even broken tools can still serve a purpose, and with those same broken parts, I've built a life she no longer has access to. Not out of contempt, but simply because I no longer trust her with those tender, sacred pieces of me. Last week, a letter from her arrived in my mailbox. Handwritten and slightly disheveled, a return address from a quieter town I'd heard about on the news. She wrote about working with at-risk youth and trying to forge a meaningful path for herself again. She shared how clarity had finally started to emerge in her life, how she could see now what I had carried for so many years. She ended with an apology. I'm sorry I left you to carry it alone. I read it twice before carefully placing it in the drawer alongside others she sent before. Emails, letters, texts, all slightly more sincere than the last, but never accompanied by action or consistent presence. Words are easy. Repair requires so much more. So no, I didn't respond this time either. But I didn't tear it up either. It belongs exactly where it is in the past. She has her journey now and I have mine. Maybe someday she'll become the woman I once believed she could be. Maybe she already has. But that doesn't mean I'm obligated to clear a seat for her at my table again. That table is smaller now. Intentional, filled only with those who see me, trust me, respect me, not because of obligation or blood ties, but simply because they want to be there. That's my definition of family. Mutual care and mutual respect. She surrendered that place when she told me to let go. If my story resonates with you, if you've ever